We can start. Yeah. Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the justification for the debate that we just watched. My name is Masharia. I will be your chair, and I will be running you through this justification. How I'm going to do it first is that I'm going to give you the rankings. Two, I'm going to do a brief explanation of the rankings, and then three, I'm now going to actually do the justification for the rankings. And then after that, I'll allow my panelists to also give a few general tips on things that we can be able to improve on. Just give me a second to set my timer just so that I don't ramble on for a very long time. All right, let's get started. What is the rankings? In the end, we ended up at a consensus decision, and the consensus is that the team that wins is the team on proposition. So congratulations to the team prop on winning the round. A couple of general comments here. We think that there was potential for the opposition to win. We did think that there was material, especially coming from the deputy leader of opposition speech, that could have probably flipped us. However, there are two main problems to this. One, it was non-engaging with some preemptive framing that I'll talk about in terms of how these trade-offs look like. But then secondly, specifically with regards to the most impactful part of the case, we really think it was sort of underdeveloped. And I think more focus on those things would have probably helped the op case probably weigh out a bit better in the debate. And I'll talk about that in my justification. Let's start with that concept of what do we believe possibly could have been the op win and the question of the clash of the framing of the debate specifically. What we get from the opposition is that, one, to a large extent, this debate is about where we're able to capture the best accuracy of what these lived experiences are and specifically what these movements go about. And they go about by proving this, especially in the deputy's framing, that you can have both. To the extent that you have both, then to a large extent, all the prop benefits can be co-opted to their side, while at the same time, they have the benefit of academia and all the benefits that academia probably has, whether it's with regards to how accurate it is, how niche it is, how it focuses on different topics, and how intellectualism can boost the movement, all that. So I think the way they try to weigh this out is co-opting the benefits of prop while still having a net benefit on their side that doesn't trade off against the op. And I'm sure if we did believe this, I think opposition probably wins. But why did that not work? I think the reason why the idea of them having both does not work in this round is preemptively because in the Prime Minister's speech in the first sentence, I think we do get the proper framing of the round that still gets what op is trying to say, which is that there's a likelihood that both will exist. However, a trade-off must exist. But even if we did believe op that both exist, then prop can still get the op benefits that they're talking about, because Prime Minister says they still have academia happening on their side, academic research happens on their side. It just is void or devoid from the movement in terms of its impact. So you can still have social science professors researching on these things and engaging on how to change structures, just different from what the movements are specifically engaging on. So the idea was, and I think it was already considered in the PM, that both can exist. However, the question was whether or not we use this academic signaling in the social movements. And I don't think op managed to engage why. I think why that framing of prop where academic research happens, but is engaging with structures differently and away from social movements and the impacts of that. So therefore, we couldn't credit the opposition deputy's speech in terms of co-opting the prop benefits because it had already been conceded just differently. I think we needed more direct engagement as to why the form of signaling that happens within social movements is more likely to create bigger impacts than the movements, than it or academia trying to fight structures or trying to fight the inequalities away from the social movements and differently. To that extent, I think more engagement on that would have probably helped. But more importantly, I think the debate did have an implicit trade-off that needed to happen in order for the debate to function. One, what is, trade-off to the movement, to the minorities? How do they engage with these things? I think the debate concession, like in its implicit concessions, did have trade-offs that needed to be justified as to why one side likely is better than the other. So on the movement and the minorities and the member of the movement. So the framing clash, just a summary of that way. One, a lack of engagement on the preemptive framing about how academia engages with the structures. Op should have probably engaged on that in order to win. But then secondly, the trade-off does exist. And in terms of any clash to happen in the debate, the trade-off must exist. Therefore, we will then engage on the clashes of the trade-offs and how we saw this happening. So then that leads us to two clashes then that happen in the debate and determine the call, which is one, which form of signaling is more likely to create a buy-in? Two, which form of signaling is likely to create change? Three, is academic research good or bad? So let's just engage on those three things and then decide or tell you how we weigh them out. What do we get on the buy-in clash from both teams? Prop says that this trade-off is unjustified because what happens is that there's a trade-off between the discourse of people on the ground versus the discourse of academics. Too, they talk about why the comparative nature of this dialogue is likely to be disadvantageous to the most critical group in this debate, which is the minorities, which then leads to alienation of those minorities, and then further alienation of people in developing countries, then further alienation of people in the majority, and then overall the impact is that social movements just become largely ineffective. What does OP say? OP says that this is likely to be reasonable. It's more likely that when you use props method of signaling, it's likely to be seen as isolated cases. You can also have more minorities signaling in academia, therefore they can speak to lived experiences, and the whole idea of language signaling, improving access and pushing the boundaries in order to create macro changes as the deputy is talking about. So that's what the team said. How do we weigh the engagement on these two teams? I think one, on whether or not OP is able to get its benefits, this is the first thing. We think that the most impactful case of the OP, other than engagement, was on how you're able to create change, which comes in the deputy leader of opposition speech, about why this form of information or signaling or messaging is more likely to interact with people who are in structures of power, like politicians, and this is able then to them to be able to use this to be able to create or effect some level of change. Why is this not winning? One, we think it's largely underdeveloped to the extent that we don't get an analysis as to how, one, it's likely going to interact other than they are reasoning with each other. Two, how that then leads to the change. I think there was a big jump that needed as to how then resonating leads to you actually being able to institute the level of macro changes, because that's a huge impact that was being claimed. We think it was sort of underdeveloped. It's sort of lacked a couple of incentive structures, buy-in in terms of whether it's bipartisan or stuff like that. Whatever it is that you are going to explain, I think it's more implicit. There are implicit links there, but we can't make them for you. The OP did not explain that macro impact. Other than that, I think then on the other issues of impact in terms of minorities, the movements and stuff like that, on whether or not it's more likely to cause alienation, we think the proposition did prove that to a large majority of people, this language is inaccessible and it's unable to be able to resonate with these people because of their lack of ability to understand, their lack of ability to communicate in this language, the sort of imposter syndrome that comes from the PM, that you feel just threatened by the level of information that you have, and just how it's likely to be very difficult to communicate the nuances of academic terminology, especially for these people. Therefore, it's more likely that they are unable to use this in signaling in order for them to be able to, pass that message. Therefore, they are less likely to engage. I think the opposition's only response here is that you could have minorities, in those panels, and have an incentive for them to be able to frame it in a way that is understandable. I think that is probably true, but it still doesn't respond to what Prop is saying about, even if it's understandable, the way to communicate and the way that they would necessarily have to compete with the academics in terms of how this information or this language is used is more likely to harm them and is more likely to disincentivize them from participating than it is to participate. So on who is more likely to get buy-in or engagement from those minority people, Ob is right, it can be palatable, but can it be communicated? Can it be expressed? Would these people not feel that threat of just overarching jargon that they just can't use? I think probably weighs out by just proving why, in a vast majority of instances, the most critical individuals are unlikely to do this. Two, on whether or not the majority is able to do this, I think probably shows that this is something that brings interaction and engagement and something like that, on whether or not the majority engages. But I think OP is able to flip that in two ways. I think showing who is able to capture the majority, those who are not in the minority. Two ways. One, they managed to show that the visceral nature of lived experiences is a far more compelling mechanism for getting more and more people to participate than just general academic discussions. When people are talking about their lived experiences, you are more likely to capture those people rather than having academics discussing, which does get engagement. I do agree with OP, but which one is more likely to get more engagement? I think the Deputy Prime Minister speaks specifically about why the appeal of intellectualism is something that is just likely to harm the movement because of the appeal of intellectualism, trading off from easy to understand lived experiences that are just massive. Therefore, on where the majority would engage, we do believe that OP probably has it, but the response from Prop flips that by proving why that majoritarian perception in terms of which one are they easily going to engage with, I think they just show more likely that that happens on their side. So then on the idea of whether or not that trade-off is justified, I think it's summarized by my first two clashes. I think losing the minority and losing the majority then makes it much harder for op to be able to achieve any of their benefits, while prop is able to show a majority are able to get access to this information, engage with this information. Therefore, they are more likely then to create impacts on social movements and why this is important. So on the buy-in clash, that's how that went. And we do think that on those three levels, who is more likely to get buy-in of the minority? Who is more likely to get engagement with the majority? And the whole clash about the impact of that in terms of movements. If prop has won both those two, then whether or not the movements become more effective then goes to the prop. I hope that makes sense. I know it was long, but anyway, it was a good debate. Lastly, on whether academic research is good or bad. This is, okay, what does prop say? It's more likely to be privileged. Two, there's a hierarchy to it, meaning that you're unlikely to challenge the boundaries of conservatism. And three, most of these times they prioritize things that are very detached from lived experiences or what's going on the ground. Op says it's not privileged because there's a trend of accepting more minorities. Two, it's likely to be more accurate because it's more researched and more nuanced, giving the example of our favorite Shamila and how they do their research. And favorite is more likely to push boundaries of research because of that conceptualization. Here's the thing. I think this clash was at best uncomparative, as I think the op probably note out, because I do think prop does prove that it's more likely that academic research is privileged, even though I think op mitigates it by proving why there's a trend or increasing trend to more acceptance and more presence of minority bodies in academia. I think it's mitigated, but I think prop's idea of whether or not how tenure works, how you get your tenure, probably means it's more likely to be still dominated by the majority. But I think the response on op still works, that why is social activism still likely not to be privileged? Because they also have a trade-off in terms of time, probably they make less money and stuff like that. Why is social activism more likely to have leaders who are less privileged? I think ops then response works in terms of saying, even you are not privileged, even you probably at best don't have that, what do you call it? You also have that privilege. So at best, what we have here is a non-comparative idea of what social movements and academia look like. Who is more privileged than the other? Not sure. I think both sides just prove that the other side is privileged. No one really proves why one form of privilege is either more than the other or one form of privilege is more harmful than the other, which would have been the best weighing mechanisms for us then to break this deadlock of this clash. So there's no explicit comparative weighing on likelihood or the harms of either side of privilege or either harm of privilege, and probably that best case, worst case scenario analysis would have been valuable here. So this at best doesn't go to either side. And at best, I hope I've made sense to you. Thank you so much for listening to me for, wow, 13 minutes for an opening half only. Thank you. I think I'll pass on to Jess to discuss the tips.
I just want to, thank you. Good job. I just wanted to give some general tips because this training session was focusing on weighing specifically and for judges on how to track weighing. So in an ideal debate, you'll have debaters do that work for you. They'll have arguments, they'll impact those arguments, and then they'll compare those arguments. And they might say, for example, this material is the most important because it is the most certain, or because it affects the largest group of people, or because it affects the most vulnerable cohort, or because it has the most longest term kind of flow, or something like that. That is ideal. And then you can kind of, those give very, where both teams have kind of made pretty good arguments on both sides. Maybe different teams have rebutted or mitigated other arguments to different degrees. This can often be a good way of breaking that deadlock. But what do you do when teams don't give you that? Because, I think in this debate, teams in the front half had a lot of material, so perhaps didn't do as much explicit weighing as they perhaps ought to. So what can you do? Broadly, three things, I think, in kind of decreasing order of being ideal. The first is just to kind of look at what teams said implicitly. So this can be, rather than say, this material is the most important because it affects the most people, it might just be by descripting or impacting things that kind of sound close to that. So for example, in this debate, we had the opening government talk a lot about buy-in to movements, social change, and they kind of impacted some of the consequences of that. And that suggests potentially a fairly impactful benefit on their side. So you can kind of look to words that speak to some of those things that would otherwise be explicitly weighed. Because generally speaking, even if teams are somewhat similar in degrees of impacting, generally there'll be one team that does it slightly better than the other. And that just might be through the characterization they give, the illustration of the scale of that, and those sorts of things. If though that is like a complete deadlock or teams don't do that for whatever reason, another way of kind of breaking this is just looking at how much teams actually dedicated to those particular issues in the debate. So for example, if both teams are spending 90% of their time talking about one issue, 10% of their time talking about another issue, team A wins the 90% clash, team B wins the 10% clash, that might be indicative of, they've allocated the most time in the debate. Now, that is not ideal in a lot of cases, and I would avoid referring to simply time spent on as much as possible. But if a team is only spending a minute on a certain point and thus are probably not illustrating many impacts stemming from that, that might be an indicator that that material ought to be viewed as somewhat less important. But I would kind of discourage you from saying, oh, they spent more time on this, ergo automatically most important. No, but it kind of helps frame implicitly, the degrees of impacting in the debate that might flow as a result. And the fourth thing you can do, or third or whatever number I'm up to, and again, this is far from ideal. These things should only be worst case scenarios, because I think, again, in 95, 96, 98% of debates, there will be a difference between impacting and weighing between teams that you can point to, right? And hopefully also engagement helps you break that deadlock. Like most teams will generally rebut one another more than the other, and you'll be able to, again, break the deadlock there. But at the end of the day, we are judging on the basis of the average reasonable voter. And there are probably just some things that the average reasonable voter might think is more important than others. So for example, in a debate about war and people dying, that's probably something that an average reasonable voter would care about, for example. And this is where, this is where sometimes our debating instinct is like young, woke, somewhat liberal leaning people might actually be slightly different with the average reasonable voter. For example, noting the trend of debating past to kind of ignore things like principles, often the average intelligent voter does care about those things. They care about those rights, freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. So try to put on the hat of the average reasonable voter if, again, you've got no other way of breaking that deadlock. Again, hopefully this is a last resort. So with that in mind, final tips to keep in mind when you are weighing different material in debates as a judge. The first is that a weighing mechanism is useless if the argument that underpins it is not proven. So you can say that your argument is the most important because it's the most certain, but if the argument that sits behind that is not mechanized, then it's useless. So weighing is only good insofar as the point that underpins that is actually established. So if you've got one unproven impact that is weighed really well versus a proven impact that is not weighed as well, then probably in most cases, the proven thing still wins, yeah? The second thing to keep in mind is whilst there's no a priori expectation that closing teams ought to weigh more than opening teams, because of where they're situated in the debate, it is most often helpful for closing teams to do weighing. So for example, if you've got an opening team that has a pretty compelling set of impacts, a closing team that perhaps has an equally compelling set of impacts, because of, I guess, the positive obligation of closing teams to have material that is more persuasive than their opening, it is especially especially helpful for them to do that weighing themselves. So that is something that you can consider, again, when considering those close deadlocks. And the third reminder, the very obvious, is just to always be comparative. Punish a team for not, weighing or impacting, sure, but make sure you're doing it equally amongst all teams in the debate. Otherwise, you're not being fair to some particular teams. So those are just some tips about how to weigh when debates might be a bit messy or things appear somewhat evenly on both sides. I think that concludes this session. So we hope that's been helpful. Orcom, you can stop the stream now.